All right, welcome everyone. As people are filing into the room, if you wanted to say hello in the chat, my name's Brad. I'm going to be the host this evening. Super excited for our first conference speakers event. We'd love for you to introduce yourself, say your name and your location, and just say hello in the chat. And we'll get started shortly. Hey, Noah, Benny. Hey, John in the chat. It's great. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Hey, Jocelyn. Oh, that's awesome. So many friendly names. I can't see faces, but lots of old friends. This is awesome. We'll give it a couple of minutes as people are saying hello and getting into the room tonight. This is our first conference speaker series. Unfortunately, we didn't think we could go ahead with an in-person event, but this is the best thing that we could do. And so we're really happy to have everyone joining tonight to be talking about childcare. Hey, John. Franco. Hey, Judy. Where's the tip jar? We don't have one. We're just happy to have you here. If you want, you can renew your memberships or go to the website and give a small donation. That would be great. Thank you. Well, we're really just happy people could make it this evening on such a beautiful night here. Hey, Bill.
It's about time, isn't it?
Yeah. It's finally starting to be real spring, or feel like real spring here, which is nice. Hey, it's my mom. Hey, Lori. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started here.
Hello, Jessica.
Hi, Michael. Okay, well, a few people might filter in as we get started here, but I'd like to start off with a brief land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're here on the traditional territories of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people here in so-called Alberta on Treaty 6, 7, 8, and 10 territory. This is the traveling route and gathering place and traditional meeting grounds of the Cree, Saulteaux, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and specifically the ancestral space here in Edmonton of the Papas Chase Cree Nation. Others are joining us potentially from Treaty 7, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10, as well as from across Turtle Island. And we want to acknowledge that as we talk about our advocacy and childcare specifically tonight, that it's very important for us to recognize the history of these lands and all of the wisdom that we share and we learn from our brothers and sisters and our siblings from across Turtle Island. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Now, just a brief introduction for me. Most of you know me already, but I am so genuinely excited to be here tonight to be talking with Martha about childcare. It's an important issue for me, having had a child myself in childcare for the last few years. My daughter Maven is just about to go into kindergarten in the fall, which is wild to think about. And it's been a wild ride having her in childcare in Alberta. Our fees finally went down in January of this year, which has been a tremendous relief for myself and Maven's mom. But it's been a long road. And I'm so excited to have Martha with us tonight to talk about her experience advocating for childcare for much longer than I have been. And so we're really excited to be here to learn about the long road that got us here today and how we really need to be thinking about what comes next, because the federal funding was one thing and that was a really important milestone, but there's so much important work to do. I also want to give a big shout out to the people who, taught me about childcare. my mom, who's here today, Lori LaFortune, big childcare advocate in Saskatchewan, Sue Delaney in Saskatchewan as well. I grew up traveling around the province with them as they were in northern or remote communities talking about childcare in La Ronge and other places, and it really had an impact on me. So I'm very proud to be able to be a small part of that today. Our speaker series is all about a just recovery for all. And we thought that it would be valuable and just natural for us to talk about childcare first and foremost, as it's really a just transition, or sorry, a just program, and something that sets families and kids up for success for their entire lives, and something that we've been fighting for a long, long time as advocates across the country. And we're so excited to be in this critical moment where we have that big first step of federal agreements being signed by almost every single province and territory now. And so it just made sense for us to talk about childcare. And we're so lucky to have friends like Martha and Noah. Thank you so much for making the connection so that we could talk about what comes next here in Alberta. We have 3 more to go. There's going to be next week at 6:30 on Thursday. We're going to be talking about education with Jason Schilling. And then on the 21st at 6:30 on Thursday, we're going to be talking about housing and housing for all with Shima Robinson and a few other special guests. And then we're going to wrap up our speaker series talking with our wonderful, amazing MP, Blake Desjardins, Mustafa Farouk from NCCM, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and Laura Cruz, our Director of Organizing, as well as Trish Esterbrooks, who's the chair of the Edmonton Public School Board. So we have a wicked lineup. We wish we could be in person, but since we can't, it allowed us to have really good conversations with people like Martha here today. So just a quick note on housekeeping. We've enabled live transcriptions. They may or may not be working tonight, but we're going to try to do it on the back end if not. And then for the recording, you can share it out to people who might otherwise not be able to join us here tonight if it weren't for transcriptions. The session is being recorded right now. So it will be available at our website, just so you know. You're on camera and it's going to be distributed. And when we do the Q&A, we're just going to ask people to use the Q&A function rather than the chat function so that we can help moderate and filter those questions for Martha. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Martha very briefly. This is kind of a star moment for me. I've been excited to meet Martha and do something with her for years after having heard about her about 10 years ago in childcare advocacy world. But Martha is the founder and executive director of the Child Care Resource and Research Unit. She's been a policy researcher and advocate on childcare for a Canada-wide universal childcare program for more than 40 years. She's got substantial experience in childcare and family policy and has authored 2 books on childcare policy. She's received numerous awards, too many to count here tonight, recognizing her many contributions to Canadian childcare, including the QE2 Diamond Jubilee Medal, an honorary doctorate from Trent University, and the Broadbent Institute's Charles Taylor Prize for Excellence in Policy. So welcome, Martha, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And thanks to Public Interest Alberta. Actually, I thought you were inviting me to come to Edmonton at first, so I was really excited, but we're in a pandemic, so I'm really happy to be here. And I want to say hello to many old and new friends whom I saw coming into the chat. And this has actually been 2 weeks of almost unprecedented interest in childcare in Canada, so this is really coming at a great time. I just want to start by saying that I'm speaking to you tonight from downtown Toronto, located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, downtown Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. But in addition to the traditional land acknowledgement, I want to add a commitment for ensuring that a vision of early learning and childcare in Canada includes children and families being supported by a comprehensive and coordinated system of ELCC policies, programs, and services that are led by Indigenous peoples and that are rooted in Indigenous knowledges, cultures, and languages, and supported by strong partnerships of holistic, accessible, and flexible programming that is inclusive of the needs and aspirations of Indigenous children and families. So to begin, I'm starting from the point of view, I think, where you're starting with the series, that a just future includes a quality childcare system for all. This would be integral to the long-term vision of Canadian childcare advocates who have always envisioned childcare as a right and as a necessary part of the social infrastructure for all. So I'm going to speak for a little while. I'm going to leave lots of time for questions, which is my favorite part. So please put your questions forward. So Brad, can you change to the next slide, please? So yeah, the one after that. Okay. So this is what we're going to talk about. First, I want to talk about how did we get to this moment after decades of advocacy, and then talk about the critical puzzle pieces in an ELCC system that works for all, not just for the few. Then what do we need to do now? And then what's next? So I want to just talk about how we got to this moment after decades of advocacy for universal childcare. But first, I want to talk about where we are. What is this moment for childcare? So where we are at this moment, I think you alluded to this already, Brad, is that we have the commitment and we've laid the foundation, and we're beginning to build a universal childcare system, which is what I'm going to elaborate on that. But I first want to talk a little bit about how we got here after 50 years of advocacy. And it is really just about 50 years of advocacy. So I'm not going to go back to the dark ages or to 1970 and the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, or to feminism in the 1980s, which were all really important. What's most important is that Canada's had a continuing progressive feminist childcare movement since the 1970s, which became really solidly entrenched in the 1980s. And the advocacy and policy positions that this group developed has now emerged as the foundation for the universal childcare system we're beginning to build. So the childcare moment we are in now is a product of both that history, but also the pandemic. So I'm going to talk about the pandemic. I should just say that if you really want to read a little bit about the history of childcare advocacy, I'll put a great article by Lisa Pisoli, who's a historian of childcare, in the chat that is really worth reading, and that kind of sums a lot of those issues and who was involved up. It's really great reading. But the COVID pandemic really did two things to childcare, or really for childcare. And these two things were linked. The first thing that happened, if you go back to March 2020, was when we had the first wave of the pandemic, and it's hard to believe that we're now in the sixth wave, but what happened was that public health authorities in just about across, in every province and territory, closed most of regulated childcare. It partly was because people didn't really know how to react, what to do, how dangerous was it, how to react to it, and all that sort of thing. And the penny really dropped, the recognition that people couldn't work without childcare. And this went for people who had essential workers, people who were streetcar drivers, nurses, had trouble going to work, and people who were working at home, particularly women, had trouble working at home. So there was this new kind of recognition, like, oh, this is where childcare fits in. That's why we have childcare. But it became a really widespread and entrenched recognition. The second thing that happened, though, was as parent fees weren't any longer available to fund the childcare operations, because that's what most of the funding is parent fees. So the service providers didn't know what to do, and they tried charging people fees if they weren't using childcare. But all in all, what happened was they were very shaky, to the point where in a survey that we actually did, 72% of services that we surveyed, there were about 8,000, laid off some or all of our staff. That lasted for a period of months. So it became painfully obvious how tenuous this newly recognized essential service was. And there was a huge fear that childcare would collapse. It didn't really happen. And the reason it didn't really happen is because the federal government started funding funds to small businesses, the CEWS and the CERB and other kinds of things that filled in the gaps and kind of glued childcare together. So we came out of that phase of the pandemic with childcare quite damaged but kind of still preserved. And that's really the situation that we're kind of still in today. The thing is that advocates made the most of this. Advocates in this case included not only people myself, but also feminists in the federal Liberal government, which included some of the cabinet ministers like Krista Freeland and Karina Gould, the minister, and some of their colleagues. And I'd say that there was a tremendous advocacy effort, both to encourage the federal government to move forward with a major commitment on childcare and to make it as consistent. We tried to get it made as consistent as we could with the vision of a childcare system that we had developed over all of those years. And really what that meant was moving from a market-based patchwork to a universal, publicly funded, publicly managed, not-for-profit, inclusive, high-quality system for all. Well, when we got to last year's federal budget, and it's funny that today is the next federal budget, but last year's federal budget was the big one, and we knew that childcare was coming in the federal budget, but we were pretty stunned when we heard that it was $30 billion, which was more money than we had anticipated. And it also did include many of the policy issues that we had advocated for: publicly funding parent fees, limiting for-profit childcare, addressing workforce issues, national legislation. These were at least identified, although it was, of course, a budget, but not a policy document. And, following that commitment, it took until last week for the federal government to secure bilateral agreements with all the provinces and territories, and to at least get going on entrenching the Parallel Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Agreement, the IELCC. So that's the short story of how we got here after 50 years. But now I would just want to return briefly to what is here, childcare's moment. And I keep thinking that was best put by Winston Churchill when he said partway through World War II, this is not the end or even the beginning of the end, but rather it's the end of the beginning. So we now have a significant long-term federal proposal, very significant federal funding, 13 provincial territorial agreements, and it's a huge and historic commitment. But we need to keep in mind that it's phase one of building the childcare system we've advocated for. So what comes next is what I want to talk about and discuss for the rest of our time tonight. So if you could flip to the next slide there. And I apologize for anybody who has seen this picture before. I borrowed it from the Canadian Child Care Federation. We use it all the time. So a key question to begin with is this: what are the critical puzzle pieces in an ELCC system that works for all, not just for the few? And I want to start with this idea that we always use of the three-legged stool. This schematic shows that the childcare stool with the legs of affordability, accessibility, and quality all need to be solid or the stool will fall over. What we mean by this is you have to pay attention to each of these, but also you have to work on them simultaneously so weakness in one area doesn't threaten the other areas. And I want to use as an example the idea of reducing parent fees, which has really taken precedence as the policy issue. But one of the things that we know is that reducing fees will drive up demand. And this will be unmet demand if there's not adequate expansion, which is the accessibility leg. And this needs to ensure that appropriate spaces become available for parents to use. But also further, without attention to the workforce issues such as wages, recognition, working conditions, there are not going to be enough qualified educators to allow expansion to happen. So this idea of the three-legged school really means that we need a holistic approach to childcare policy, and that all of these issues are interlocked and need to be paid attention to kind of simultaneously and worked on. So let me just drill down here on the idea of the puzzle pieces. And if you could flip to the next slide there, Brad. So this is really drilling down on the system building puzzle, the pieces. And I apologize because the puzzle doesn't really represent these things. But what I really want to point out here is that in this puzzle, which fits together, there's two main sort of blocks, two main important elements that are necessary for transformation and success of this system that we're talking about. And the first one is that we need public money that is operational funding, that funds the costs of operating the child care program, which we don't have except in bits and pieces at this point. But what we really need is that money will cover decent wages of the staff that will be an integral part of the budget, not just an add-on like a wage enhancement grant. It needs to kind of cover the staff, which is actually most of the budget of a childcare center. So in a nonprofit center, it'll be 85, someplace between 85 and 90% of the budget is the staff anyway. So that piece there is really, really important to kind of stabilize the system, allow the staff money to be, not an afterthought, but kind of integral to the ongoing operation. And the money has to be sufficient enough so the program isn't relying on parent fees as a main source of income. So that's kind of happening through, through wage cuts, but it hasn't really been actualized fully enough yet. This is not true only in Alberta, it's true in most of the provinces, but that's a very important piece. And the other really important puzzle piece is this issue of expansion, which is necessary for the system to work, for people to be happy with it. Otherwise, people are going to be very unhappy if we have lower fees for a limited number of people and it doesn't expand. So let me just explain how, I think people probably know how the expansion of childcare now works in Canada. That childcare center over there on the corner got there because some person or group, a private individual, public or nonprofit, it could be the YMCA, it could be a parent group that has gotten up and going, it could be an entrepreneur, has made a decision to put the childcare there. And they can also decide to close the childcare because it would be private. The way we really need to think about this is that this really needs the assurance that there will be services there becomes part of a publicly managed planning process. There is no other way that we're going to get equity of childcare and distribute it where it's needed. Make sure that that small town gets childcare, this low-income community gets childcare, and the pieces of that are necessary. And this again has been accepted as a federal from the federal government, that it will be primarily not-for-profit and publicly operated childcare. We also need, in order for this to work, we need capital money. And we saw today in the federal budget this afternoon that they've started a childcare infrastructure fund that has capital money, and which we hope will eventually will ramp up. And again, in order to make this work, you need an adequate number of qualified staff. So a couple of additional elements to make it work as a system is that even beyond expansion, we generally need more public management in order to meld it into a system. And that could occur through different routes. In Ontario, we have the experience of municipalities acting as local service managers. And so they do all the administration, they flow the money, the subsidies, they do service planning, a lot of functions like that. And that's one route that I must admit I'm very partial to that role of municipalities. Nova Scotia in their action plan came up with a really interesting a quasi-public central agency model that would take over a lot of functions like advertising for staff, hiring, some of the financial administration, so that the childcare programs themselves can concentrate on being childcare programs. So that's one thing, is much more public management. We also need evidence-based policymaking, and here I would say that Canada is kind of lucky to be a laggard, because there is so much good evidence about what makes the best early learning and childcare policy, what the different options are, that comes from other countries. I mean, there's very good policy research on this, and to some extent, we are taking advantage of it. We should take full advantage of it. Another important element that we've been talking about for many, many years, as long as I can remember, is that we need data and we need research in a lot of areas. Even though there's been talk about this in the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I think a solid agenda for these is still missing in action, even though it's critical for accountability and good policymaking. And the last element that I want to mention is I think we really need the opportunities for real democratic engagement in an ongoing way. And that would mean at all sorts of levels, that parents should be able to have a say about their children's program. The workforce needs to have a say about what happens to them. And at the policy level, I think there are very good examples of how this can actually work. And I think it needs to be real engagement, not sometimes we have a lot of pro forma kind of consultation. And there may be other elements that other people may want to bring up in questions, but that's my package of, our package of what the puzzle pieces look like. So if you could flip to the next there, Brad. So the question is, what do we do now that we are at this moment? And we have to do a lot. And I would say, when I sort of think about it, that our work is really cut out for us for a decade to try to really, get the system, a really good system in place. I would say we're not alone in this too. I noticed that today, the federal child care minister, Karina Gould, tweeted that there's much more work to do. But she also said it's thanks to the consistent advocacy of so many of us who are here today. And she did comment to me, she said, well, all your work is cut out for you, for many years. So I think there's a recognition that we're here and we really need to move on and do a lot more work. So what is our work to do? And I would say, thinking about this, and I'm not talking about government now because government has its own roles, but I'm talking about all of us here in whatever walk of life we are in the community, which would include frontline staff, it would include service providers, it would include researchers and people teaching at colleges, the whole package of people, people in unions, the group of people that we call the child care movement. When I say advocacy at all levels, there's a lot of things under that umbrella. So I just want to talk a little bit about what are the things that I think will make that work going forward based on some of our experience. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of a vision, a shared common vision, a key part of the roadmap so you know where you're going. And I think that that's absolutely necessary. And from that, you can develop your common messages and things like that. And I would say that the child care advocates have been very much part of, and this is at a Canada-wide level, since about, I guess since before the election where the Liberals were elected, we started really building a shared vision. We had a big policy conference, Child Care 2020, that was part of it. And we've been working on honing up the shared vision. So it really becomes much easier to talk about things and to react to things, and people are more on one page. I think that's very important. The second thing I want to just mention is that knowledge is really power. And this is not only about the need for, good accessible data and research, but also those in the childcare sector, people who are actually childcare providers, early childhood educators. It's very important to be knowledgeable about policy and how it affects you and your work. It's pretty easy to understand if a ratio change is proposed, that it might have an effect on your work. And on the plus side, it's really important to know how much, know that somebody is talking about bringing in prep time as part of your work week. Like all of these kinds of things, it's a matter of engagement in what's happening and how does it affect you and your, professional, your professional life. But I think knowledge has been majorly important in childcare advocacy. I guess another thing is be strategic, which means sometimes learning how things work, like how does government work, like what happens when a legislation is presented, what's the role of regulations, There's many, how do you get together with other people? What are the times that you present things? It's having a strategy is kind of related to the next thing, which is kind of thinking long-term. And I don't mean this only about being patient, but sometimes thinking in steps, that first you do this, then you do that, then you do that. So it's sort of like, sort of kind of scoping things out and thinking, but understanding that things might not happen immediately. Very important to remember that childcare is very political. And I think it's political in multiple senses. One is it's used politically, it's very representational of certain attitudes towards women and the family, the role of the state. There's often an ideological component to it. I do remember many years ago that many people who were early childhood educators didn't feel comfortable engaging in politics. And that might very well still be, I don't know, whether that's true or not, but it is a political issue, and it's not possible to get funding for it and policy for it unless somebody enters into the political realm. And the last thing I think that we've learned, and I think that's really important to think about now, is the importance of collaboration and solidarity. And I can't stress this enough. I think we wouldn't have survived the Harper era without that. And I think that going forward after that, it's been the key thing that I think has made the voice of advocacy really effective. It's been absolutely key. And just keep in mind that there's lots and lots of people around the country, whatever your position is in this field, there are other people in other parts of the country who are doing the same thing. So I think that that's really important as well. So, and how am I doing for time here? I don't know, actually, because I've lost track of it.
You're doing great for time.
Okay. So if you could flip to the next, if you could. So what is it that what do we need to do next? Because here is all this kind of, like advocacy at all levels, but some of this is about optimizing opportunities. And I was thinking about this, is that it's really useful to sort of think about what's out there that you can work with, or what puts you in a position so that you can do certain things. And I think we're right now, when you think about what's next, is we're actually really in a good position on childcare. And I'll sort of go into these a little bit, but I mean, I think we're in a very advantageous position to sort of like take some of the next steps, take some of these things, like learn about what it is that we need to do and put forward. And then ways to put them forward is where I sort of see a lot of the action for all of us who are involved in one way or another in advocacy. So what I want to talk about here is that there is, I've been doing this for a long time, and this is I have never seen as much public interest, media interest, and political interest in childcare. It's not like anything that I've ever seen before. And there were, some other attempts to sort of get, have a national childcare program, a national attempt, and that sort of thing. And that's a huge advantage. I mean, otherwise, it's one way that you get your message around that I think is extremely important. I guess what I left off this list is social media. I mean, we do have social media, and it's a great, I will add it to that first point here, but even on social media, there's a huge amount of interest in child. I mean, I in a way, I should have put this first, but one of the biggest opportunities, and it's unique, is that we have a federal government that has political will and has made commitments. And that's only happened before for very short periods of time. There's never been a federal government that has made this level of commitment and has made the, kind of prioritize it at a high level. And that's an enormous opportunity. That's our major opportunity. In Alberta, you've already got I'm sure some of you are out there. You have an Alberta roadmap that's kind of scoped out the situation, set out a vision, and set out solutions. That's invaluable. And of course, that's very aligned with the national roadmap, and there are roadmaps that have been developed in some of the other provinces. So that comes to the next point, is that there's a Canada-wide childcare movement that are working on this at the national level, and as much as possible, province by province and territory by territory. It's very, very important because it's kind of synced together, but it's also, responds to the particular situation. And it's very important, I think, now that Alberta childcare advocacy is now coming together in a way that I haven't seen before, and it's now part of it. So that's a major, major opportunity as I can see it, and I can only see that improving. And then again, we have anybody working in this has people to collaborate with in other provinces, and that would be groups and people and researchers and all sorts of things. And there's a lot to be found in that, because there's quite good, it's interesting when you look across the provinces and territories, there are interesting things going on in just about all of them. And, to be able to learn about them and say, well, maybe this is something that we should know about in our province. I've seen some of that happening, and it's actually really major, and it's a really great thing to be involved in. And there's a provincial election coming up in Alberta, and there's no time like an election for childcare to be on the agenda. So, and I'm sure there's many, many other opportunities, but it's sort of a matter of, kind of honing up childcare as an issue, making sure that there's resources and allies and knowledge, and then making sure that these opportunities and other opportunities, many other opportunities that people will think of, are taken. So, I think it's I wouldn't even say it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. I mean, it's the worst of times because it's still in a pandemic, and, we have climate change issues, and we have a war in Ukraine. On the childcare front, we're moving along in a way that we never have. And if we don't, we have a real possibility of really making ground in childcare for the first time ever that in my career on this. So I just can't move. Could you flip to the next thing, which is, I think, the last? So, I'm sure people probably know this quote by Margaret Mead that I used to have on my door when I was a student. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And in an odd way, it's kind of has a common theme to this, which is this is my favorite childcare cartoon. I think the common theme is that sometimes or often sticking to it leads to success. And has really been true with childcare thus far. And I think what I want to put forward is that it seems like a good thing to carry forward, because that's the only way we're going to make sure that what emerges is truly the transformation we've been working for all of these years. If we can't get that, I think the way we should look at it, it shouldn't be our fault that we tried. So, thinking about it that way, sticking to it and sort of carrying forward, and, in anything like this, there are times that are very difficult. They seem quite hard. Anybody here who works on childcare policy and experienced the Harper era, like some of us did, where things really, went backward, and people were kind of, we were sort of enemies of the state, really. We kind of survived that. And if you sort of think about how you can carry this forward, sometimes you really have to sort of keep on with it and think that maybe you really can change things at a high level. So, that's my view of how we got here, what we have to do, what are the pieces and things that we can do. And I'm really happy to take everybody's questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martha. That was fantastic. And you kind of answered my question already, which was basically how you continue on in those dark moments. When I think about some of the advocacy that IA is focused on alongside the labor movement, their advocates, whether it's labor law reform or healthcare cuts or housing as a human right. Easy to forget the long view. And it was really inspiring to hear you talk about how you kept at it over the years, even in those dark moments, even in the Harper years. And so one question though, just to drill down on that, what sort of things can you say about those, those dark moments that really did keep the community and the movement alive for you and for everyone at the center of it?
Some of it actually, you have to have fun doing it, I mean, there are a group of people, and I think some of them actually are on this in this webinar. It's kind of an avocation. It's real. If you like policy, it's a really, really interesting area. And if you have people that you can share that with, and it kind of becomes fun. And I have to say, the childcare movement has always had fun. So, some of it's revolved around having dinner and, good wine and all that. So, I mean, I'm not being facetious. I mean, I'm serious about this, is that kind of kept things going. But there was periods of time where we had no successes at all. Like it was pretty bleak. And what kept it going? I don't know. I mean, I do think that it's sort of, well, I always assume that things will change, so maybe that's the kind of thing that people think, is that let's give it a shot and see if we can keep it going. But there were some pretty dark days in there. And, people did drop away. And sometimes I keep getting emails from people that I haven't heard from in 20 years. And they say, wow, this is really great. I should have stuck with it. So, people just kind of try to keep their spirits up, thinking that we'll be successful someday.
That's incredible. And in Alberta, it's been amazing working with people like Siobhan Vipond over the years, and Barb Silva, and Morna drops in on us and makes sure we're on the right track, Christopher Smith, and the collaboration and the sense of joy in the work is really, it's powerful.
Yeah, it is. I actually do think that that's one of the things that's really kept it going, is that kind of collaboration and solidarity. And it may exist in other areas, but it certainly exists. I think it's the thing that, I never realized that we were a social movement. When I was still at U of T, one of the faculty kept saying, childcare is a classic social movement. It has different groups, coming in, and they're not all, they're mutually supportive, but they're not necessarily all the same thing. But there has been a kind of a core that has actually generated, kind of the ideas and put them out there for discussion. The other thing is, I think you have to enable people to participate. It does have to be democratic. So, it's not like, it comes from the center. It can't all come from the center, because people won't feel part of it. And I think those are the kinds of ideas that have kept things going.
Great. We have a question from Franco Savoya down in Calgary. He's one of the chairs of our task forces, and he wants to thank you for your excellent presentation. And if you could comment on the Quebec system, which is often referred to as ideal or close to ideal. So just some comments about how that is referred to as sort of an ideal system to build towards. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, in Quebec's one main big idea, when it moved to what they called for years the new policy, that was a long time ago, is basically they funded the services. That was really the thing that they did that was different. So until then, they had a fee subsidy system like everybody else did, and they started funding the services. But there are a lot of pieces that they never did do. So they never really, took on they waited for the nonprofit sector to kind of open up childcare, and it never really expanded enough. So there was always a big demand problem. And many people, our colleagues in Quebec, really point out that there's a lot of weak quality in Quebec. And I think that that's probably true. There's different reasons for that. I mean, I don't think that let me think how to put this. I myself have never thought that this is the ideal. I think what people are referring to when they say we want to do what Quebec did is that they funded the services so that the fees could be low. Low enough for many people to afford. I want to point out one thing about Quebec is that one thing that never has been dealt with is that below the flat fee, which is now $8.70 a day, it's across the board. It's even for low-income families. Mm-hmm. So there is a problem there about low-income families being left out of childcare, and my colleague Krista Japel has done work on this. So, I don't like to think of it as this is the ideal system. I think if you look around, you can see some really great pieces in different places and say those are the kinds of things we should incorporate.
I've got a question here from Wanda that Finland has certified teachers in their daycares. Is this something that like your organization or Child Care Now was advocating for when you talk about workforce development here?
Well, think about it this way. What a teacher is certified, like there's different kinds of certified teachers. So in a lot of places, the teacher of young children, you know, like the early years, is a certified teacher, but in early years, educated certified teacher. So, you know, like there's a question of what it is that they are an expert in and what their certificate, you know, their credential is. And I think that there is good reason to think that more education, post-secondary education is better in childcare. I mean, like there's some research that show, you know, certainly post-secondary education, how much it is. Some American research would suggest that it might be should be a 4-year degree, at least for some people or many people. But I think most people would agree that it should be education to work with young children, not just being a teacher. They're just, you know, you could be a high school teacher or a math teacher or, you know, music teacher, and it doesn't mean, so I think when they say that about Finland, they probably mean a teacher who's trained in early childhood education, who has teacher certification. I'm sure that's true.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
How important is it to think about building support in rural and remote communities as, you know, it's not separate from, but it's different in our experience in Alberta for sure, and I'm sure, you know, everywhere. And how do you think about that in terms of your advocacy and building support and the movement and the solidarity that you were talking about?
Oh, as far as I know, rural communities need childcare, want childcare also. The main reason, I mean, we did a big report on rural childcare that's on our website a couple of years ago, and we interviewed rural childcare programs, a whole, you know, bunch of things, looked at all the literature. The thing is that the main reason that there is, it goes back to what I said about expansion. There's less people likely to turn up, say, I want to open up a childcare center in that town. It's one thing, but also the system of funding mitigates against having childcare in areas where there's low population density. You know, because if you only have a small childcare center, it's really hard to break even. And that's kind of the criterion for existing as a childcare center. If you change the whole thing and say, well, it's funded as a system, like if you go to, I once was on a trip, just a, you know, as a tourist, you know, as a family trip, up to the top of Norway. And was going to go, you know, like, I don't know, like bird watching or something like that. And there was like a little childcare center in this tiny little fishing village right at the top of Norway. It was like a little A-frame on the tundra. So I went and chatted with them, and they were, you know, like there were 15 kids. It was there because the government put it there and the government funded it. So it's not that people don't want it or that they don't need it. So it's much more that you have to tailor it and you have to make sure that they have it because they're as entitled to it. And they also, if you like look at what people do in rural communities, it's not that women are, you know, they're not in the house looking after the children. And you talk to families where the mother is a farmer, you know, or doing what, you know, whatever. So I think it's much more a matter of the way it's set up, and that you have to make sure that rural communities and you know, less densely populated communities have childcare also. Great.
I have a question here in the Q&A. Can you speak a little bit more to what gives you optimism and hope? I am thinking back to 2005 and the great excitement of Minister Dryden signing agreements with all the provinces, and then the massive disappointment as the agreements were torn up by the newly elected Conservative government. So how can a national childcare program survive a changing government? And do you think that things are different this time around?
I think they're different in a couple of ways. I mean, for one thing, it fell because the government changed, and now I mean, we have a minority government, but they did make this agreement with the NDP, which is great for childcare because we have some years to work on it. I mean, we were quite worried that we would see another Harper. I mean, that was Harper's first act after being sworn in, and it was very harsh for all of us. But I think the other thing is that if you think about this last federal election, whenever it was, September or whenever we had the federal election. But even the Conservatives, they didn't say we shouldn't have childcare. You know, Erin O'Toole's platform is not no childcare. It was we should fund childcare differently. We don't agree with that way of funding childcare, but if you look at the language, I think there's been a real shift in the acceptance that childcare needs to be is essential, essentially, on the part of people that never would have said that before. And I wouldn't say that the Conservatives really embraced it, but they did have a lot of language saying this is important and we know that everybody needs it and it's the economy won't recover that if you look at the language. So I think that there's been a real change there. And I do remember Ken Dryden, I mean, this is one thing that he always did say is that you need to get enough of it in place that you paint yourself into a corner so that you do enough so that it can't be taken away. And that did happen in Quebec. In the beginnings of the program, I remember there was an election after maybe 2 years after it got started, and Jean Charest was running to be the Liberal, for the Liberal Party at that time, was the Liberal leader, and he actually campaigned that he would close the program, and he lost. I mean, I'm not saying he lost for that reason, but it was a most unpopular statement. So once people have gotten the experience of it, once you cut the fees and have a critical mass of people, I don't even know if it has to be a majority actually using the services, it really shifts it. And I think there's a lot more people who are not the usual suspects on childcare who actually understand why we need to have it now than we did in Paul Martin's time.
Makes sense. We have a question about the pandemic in relation to workforce development and workforce, I guess, sustainability. Obviously, the pandemic caused a crisis in EC workforce. What do you think those of us who are training pre-service educators should keep foremost in our mind moving forward into this system building time after framework agreements have been signed?
Yeah, the workforce it's like the linchpin, and people who are I keep thinking about, I want to say that, but I also want to reflect on the fact that even though there's a lot of lip service to how important the workforce is, it hasn't really been recognized in any of the agreements. Now, a number of them have commitments to actually having a wage grid, which I actually think would make a difference if it's a halfway decent one. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but I think it'll make a difference. But I think other things have to happen. So I would actually be educating those educators to understand that they have some power. Actually, the childcare workforce may end up having power. I mean, just imagine what would happen if they were all unionized, for example. I mean, it is quite critical for the economy to work to have childcare. So I think that the problem really is that yes, we need to train more early childhood educators, but retention has always been a bigger problem than recruitment. And the problem really is that the wages and working conditions, and wages are, I'd say, our understanding is the wages are foremost, but it's not all that there is to it. It's career ladders and recognition and, what the nature of the work is and how you have autonomy. There's lots of other working condition issues. I mean, my view and our view is that we really need to have a thorough national workforce strategy. I think it should be Canada-wide because I think people move around, and I think the issues aren't so different from province to province. So I would do all of those things. I think that people who are teaching early childhood educators have a really important role to play in this whole picture.
That's great. Thank you. We've recently elected 2 new mayors and councils in our big cities and across the province. Both mayors from Calgary and Edmonton have expressed some pretty serious interest in ELC. Can you speak to the potential roles that municipal governments can play in helping to build out the ELCC system?
Oh, how long do you have? I think it's let me think how to put this. I think if you look at successful early learning and childcare systems, there's generally a municipal role. And we've done a bunch of papers that are on our website. One of them there are 2 that have to do with municipalities. One is the municipal role in actually delivering childcare, public childcare. as we used to be done in Alberta and used to be done in Ontario and has really diminished. And the other role is kind of this more, kind of local administrative public management kind of role, where one of the things that I think is really important is that land use planning, which I think is very important in expanding childcare, is a municipal function. It's a municipal function, but it's all the things that what they do in Ontario is quite different. They actually administer all the money, they plan for services, they make a lot of policy decisions and things like that. So I'd really like to see that at least considered, I guess this is what I mean, is that there are many policy options that should be of that nature that would really entrench childcare, has the possibility of making it better, certainly has the possibility of further expansion, bringing it closer to the people and all that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that I would like and will be encouraging the federal secretariat to be kind of taking up as issues and kind of working up as policy issues and seeing where the provinces may fit in, essentially. So that's my answer. I think it could play a very important role, actually.
Thank you. A comment from one of our superstar advocates here in Alberta, the chair of our Child Care and Early Learning Task Force, Donna Szynski. Hi, Donna. She has a question about collaboration and how critical it is. Can you say a little bit more about how you and others came together to build a strong movement in the first place? Like, was it just for a bottle of wine, or how did that happen?
That's a really good question, Donna. I mean, some of it is quite organic in that it goes back a long way, but some of it isn't. Some of it was very intentional. So I guess there's kind of different iterations of it. Like the one, what I didn't discuss, which goes way back. Some of that happened really through the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, which doesn't exist anymore. It was like through the organized women's movement, really played a major role in pulling that together. But most recently, it was quite an intentional decision in the Harper era that a number of organizations at the national level should get together and think about how we were going to survive, literally, because things were so bleak. And we did come together and started talking about how, essentially, if we don't float together, we're all going to sink separately. And we did start thinking about the kinds of things, and some people from Alberta were involved in this, actually. And I think that was kind of the core of pulling together, kind of re-establishing, kind of it was almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes. It was still there, but it was kind of it was kind of dying. And I think it was an intentional building of collaboration and solidarity, and that's still going on today. I think it's majorly important, actually. I can see all sorts of other things happening that are not. I mean, there's always new things to do, and only so much you can do at one time. But it's been quite successful so far, and it has lots of room for other people and other organizations, other types of things. So I don't know if I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. The question here from Andy Sims. He's my favorite labor lawyer, and many other people's here in Alberta. So he's got a question about workforce terms and conditions and how they're set. His experience is that too often a source of strain and conflict is that it's done at the individual center level, particularly if parents are placed in a conflictual role vis-a-vis staff.
Yeah.
The question then is, are sectoral or provincially set rates a better solution to that issue?
Oh, absolutely. And let me think of how to put this. The parents' interests as fee payers, and this goes for parents on a parent board, that's where I originally started in childcare, to date have been essentially paying the staff wages. So the board in a nonprofit center makes the decisions against their own interest or in their own interest. And I really, I can't emphasize this enough. It should be a different kind of decision than that. When we say moving from a market to a system, I'm including the nonprofits, like the nonprofit cooperative childcare center that I was originally a parent in. They're private operations. I mean, they could still be a private operation, but that's when we're talking about more public management. So I'm not suggesting that all the nonprofits should disappear, but I think that some things like that, I think that having a wage grid, which they already do in Prince Edward Island and in Quebec, I think that would make a really big difference in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think it should be done through, sectoral, exactly that way.
Thank you. So how are we doing for time? It's getting late out where you are. Do you have a few more questions in you, Martha, or a few more minutes?
Oh, sure. I don't, it's kind of funny. I'm not even sure what time this is supposed to end. So just do whatever you want.
We're going to go till midnight and see if you logged off.
I'll get a bottle of wine out, I think.
Exactly. Question here about minimum standards. Okay, your books and ratings have guided parents for decades in evaluating the care their children receive. Have all the provinces pledged to adopt the same minimum standards in their framework agreements?
It's never come up.
Okay.
And we're talking about, I think here, like staff-child ratios and training and group sizes. Is that
That's my sense.
It's never been, the question of whether that would be possible for the federal government to do has not seriously been discussed. The provinces and territories generally, the staff-child ratios are pretty much in conformance with kind of what experts say staff-child ratios should be, more or less. It's on training that Canada generally doesn't meet. There's a thing called the National Standard Classification for Education. It's like it sets out standard, international standard. It's not done by the OECD. It may be done by the OECD, and Canada on the level 0 generally does not meet the standards for education in any province for early childhood for staff. Now, that's partly because in most provinces, even if there's a requirement that somebody should have post-secondary diploma or credential, it usually applies only to a minority of staff, and sometimes it's on a center-wide level. So they generally don't kind of level up. So I think this is a really good question. I mean, the way I would sort of think about it is, if the federal government has made a commitment to quality, which it has, it's one of the principles that everybody has proceeded on, and quality, you could start measuring quality with like a tool and Eckers or something like that. But probably the most likely kind of indicator would be staff, how many staff there are, and education. At some point, somebody's going to have to look at these things. So I don't know if it'll take the form of a national standard. It hasn't really been discussed yet, but it could take other forms. But I would think you can't really achieve quality unless you look at some of these things that are known to be indicators of quality, and at some point we'll have to look at them. So I imagine that will become part of the process. I just want to say one other thing is that it is true that national standards for long-term care are now, there's no difference in responsibility under federalism between childcare and long-term care facilities. And so it is an interesting question about what that might look like. So that's still to be raised, I think, but it's a good question.
It's been helpful for us to have a federal government that's at least very interested in national long-term care standards, given our experience here provincially right now. So Friends of Medicare has been doing a wonderful job advocating with their national coalition on national long-term care standards. And yeah, so that's a nice parallel. We have a question. Well, it's kind of a comment about rural, accessibility, and whether or not, existing infrastructure, like especially schools, could be used or should be used for new childcare spaces and facilities. Is that something that you've done research on or you would advocate for?
Well, well, let me think how to put it. Schools are a favored site for childcare. It not only in rural communities, but in suburban communities and in urban communities in some provinces. In Ontario, more than half the childcare is located in schools. It's located. It's not under the schools. I mean, there's childcare that could be run by the schools, but it's also just a location in the school, and it's quite common in some in Ontario more than others. I think it's sort of obvious that because kids are going to schools anyway, and a lot of school space is not used very well outside of regular school hours and their public buildings and things. I think that there's many instances where public buildings of different kinds and public land can be used for childcare locations, including existing facilities and also new facilities. But I think schools are the primary one. So even today in Ontario, new schools are not built without childcare. So Manitoba does the same thing. So that's the kind of thing, when I talk about levers for expansion, and we're talking about an expansion strategy, it's a matter of sort of gathering up all the things and saying, what are the things, what have we got to work with here, and schools would definitely fit into that. I just want to say one other thing about schools. When we're talking about childcare, we leave out kindergarten. So most of the provinces now have full-day 5-year-old kindergarten, and an increasing number of the provinces have 4-year-old kindergarten. In Ontario, there are no 4-year-olds in full-day childcare. They're all in kindergarten because that's what their childcare is. And looking at what it looks like, and I was not one who favored Doug Ford saying we should get paid for our junior kindergarten, but I think you have to look at it as part of early childhood education and care, and think about coverage and what it is that you're talking about and what the nature of the program is, and how you link it up with other programs, like with after school and all that sort of thing. So I think schools play multiple roles in it. And I think back to what the OECD, one of their, from their major policy work on childcare, one of the 8 learnings was childcare and education need to be strong, to have a strong and equal partnership. And we could do that a lot more in that, in any one of a number of ways.
I know a lot of our friends who are thinking about transitioning from childcare into kindergarten here in Alberta. It's a patchwork. There's some full day programs, lots half day, and accessibility is a big thing. So you're going from, full day childcare, if you're lucky, to kindergarten, where all of a sudden people are juggling another ball, half days every single. It's rough.
And sometimes they change, I don't know if this still happens, but it used to happen that they would switch who went in the morning when they had a lot of half day kindergarten, which they still do in some places. So kids would go in the morning for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something, and then they switch to the afternoon. That was, really harsh. So, that's what I mean when we talk about that. That's where children are, and they have, I know the school system doesn't like to hear that it is childcare. It is one of the things that the pandemic really did show, that schools are childcare, and that they can both be learning environments, and we do duplicate rather than coordinating, which is pretty foolish, and it makes just what you're describing is it makes things very difficult. It makes things difficult for kids also.
Yeah.
So
we'll wrap up with 2 more questions and then close off the evening. But we really appreciate this so much. It's been great. So first of all, a question from Karen Caprice, who's the Secretary Treasurer of the Alberta Federation of Labor and is also a registered nurse. Correct me if I didn't get that exactly right, Karen, but she has a question about accessibility, I think, when it comes to childcare meeting the needs of parents that work shift work in hospitals or other or out of town work sites, if they're commuting and they're doing 7s and 3s up north in Fort McMurray or Grand Prairie. In Alberta, I can tell you it's not great. I can tell you that from personal experience. But are there any best practices or research that you can point us towards that talks about shift work and remote work and accessibility?
Well, the thing is that non-standard hours work is a category that has lots of things in it. And Susan Prentice and Donna Lero and I did a project for the federal government innovations project a couple of years ago that looked at this, because it's a major issue. I mean, many parents don't have standard work schedules. So there's a couple of things. One is that we learned that everyone who has a non-standard work schedule doesn't need want non-standard hours childcare. Some do and some don't, depends on a whole bunch of things. But the thing is that non-standard work breaks down into categories. Some of it is much easier to deliver than other, like keeping open an extra hour, or opening up an hour earlier, or weekend childcare. And if you look at all the provinces, they're all kind of entering into this question, like, how do you do this? And again, it's like rural childcare. The funding has mitigated against providing it because it's more expensive to provide, especially if it's flexible hours. That's really, like on demand is really hard to provide. Quebec provides a lot of it. I don't know how they do that, but it's very hard to do and very expensive. So you can see that, the question is, do you do it at a work site, like a hospital where there's a lot of it, or do you do it, in a community? How you do it really does need local planning with different kinds of employers. And I would say that who did this really well when we were doing this research project was PEI, in the way they kind of approached the issue of how to think about it, and who they consulted with in their community. Like they actually met with all of the healthcare providers, the hospitals and so forth and so on, and came up with the fact that they really we're not going to get into 24-hour childcare because very few people needed it, although there were a few that did, but they would do some other things, and they would do seasonal childcare, which came up as a really big need. I think it's a perfect place where you have to look at what it is that you need in order to provide it, and also how do you plan for it. It really has to be in response to the particular situation, is what I'm saying. And I want to say one more thing, is that it is also possible, you think about work as the motivation for people needing non-standard hours childcare. They're not sending their children to it for early childhood education. They're sending that they need it because they have to work. Some work does need to be done at night, but you often think, could there not be some kind of accommodation in the world of how you define work and what people have to do? And I know this might even go as far as nurses are concerned, is that, for example, there might be periods of time in people's lives where they don't work rotating shifts or, whatever. But I think you have to look at the things holistically. And unfortunately, it means a lot of it is kind of local, and so that's why I'm very big on kind of having planning done that's responsive to local needs. But the funding has to accommodate it. People can look up this report on our website. It's called the first author is Donna Lero, and you can find it on our website. And it's a big report on non-standard hours childcare in Canada.
That's great. And your website is it crru.com or no?
It's childcarecanada.org. Childcare, and it's a database of it has, it links through keywords. You can search it by keywords, and there's a lot of tons of documents on it, like tens of thousands that are linked up to. So if people are interested, I mean, there is a lot that's been written on some of these things.
Nevina, you're incredible. She just posted the link already. That's awesome, to the website.
Thank you. That's great.
We'll have one more question, and we'll do a little bit of a wrap up here. But Martha, this goes to your slide and the wrap up of your presentation. We were talking about what's next, and a couple of times in your presentation, you talked about the importance of data and research to inform our advocacy, because knowledge is power. There's a reason why we say that all the time. And so going forward, now that we have these framework agreements, and it really seems like we've gone too far down the path for any other future government, regardless of party color, to rip up the agreements. When it comes to research and data, though, what should our researchers in the House be thinking about putting together in Alberta and Canada?
Well, oh, well, that's a huge question. I mean, so there's two different questions. There's data that is collected for the purposes of monitoring what's being done, like how is the money being spent, that type of thing. There's a data, there's what data do we need for indicators to know whether we're achieving our goals and all those kinds of things. And then there are many interesting research questions. How does this work? I mean, I can point to research in Alberta where Rob Bushman actually looked at what was happening as a result of the changes that actually had happened. Like it's really immediate research and looking at it and looking at the numbers. And I think really there, like it's good for people to be linked into what the issues are. And I could sort of, when that happens, that's really important. But it's sort of, the idea was to have at the national level a data strategy and a research strategy, and sort of talk about it in that way. And a lot of work has been done on it, but it still hasn't emerged as something that people can really hang their hat on. And I would say that also needs, the research part of it needs to have a funding strategy so that researchers can do the research. And that has not yet emerged either. And I think it's really important. There are many people always say, well, how do we know that such and such is going to work in Canada just because, so and so did it? Or, what makes a difference? Or, there's many, many, many questions. There's a huge literature in this area, but very little Canadian research, very little child development research that comes from Canada. And Canada is often missing in OECD and UNICEF assessments because the data are so poor. And so, and I'm a person who collects up the data and tries to package it up, but I'm doing it, like in my office. I mean, like, please give me a grant, I'll, do this. It's not it should be a full-blown activity that researchers can be, can be part of essentially. And so that's Canada.
Great. Thank you so much. So Parkland Institute, I'm sure, was listening to that question very closely in answer. I want to say thank you so much, Martha. This was a real joy tonight to have you.
Me too. Great questions. So thank you all.
Yes, wonderful questions and great engagement. I want to say thank you to PIA's board and executive, as well as our membership and our activists, and especially our organizational partner this evening, Child Care Now Alberta. Big shout out to Susan and her growing family. I don't know if she's here tonight, probably not, but it's been wonderful collaborating, speaking of solidarity building with them. And thank you all for being part of our speaker series. I just want to encourage everyone, if you are enjoying being a part of tonight and Public Interest Alberta, please subscribe to our newsletter. We email you pretty frequently, but it's not every day. It's often, but it's not every day. And it's good to stay engaged, especially these days when there's so much going on under this UCB government to stand up to. We send custom action alerts for your city, news, updates for your organizations, training and job opportunities, and lots more. We're also advocating right now for an office of the seniors advocate. So we're advocating for an independent office of the legislature, similar to the child and youth advocate, and we really need your help to get there. We've had some parties sign on to it, but of course the UCB government doesn't really want to meet with me or Laura. So we're trying to get more signatures to push that boulder uphill as well. So if you could check out that link and sign there as well. And then last but not least, we're undertaking a membership drive. Bill 32 in this province has put a lot of advocacy organizations under threat, and we're trying to sign up 100 new members as quickly as possible. So if you haven't become a member before, it's just a nominal fee. We'd love to have you on board, and it gives you access to all of our general membership meetings, task forces as well, and you can get involved with our organization. So we'd love to have you be a part of that if that's something that interests you. Yeah, and other than that, this is our first event. It's all about using our power to create a just future for all. And it was really wonderful hearing you, Martha, talk about your commitment over the years, even through the bumpy times. That was a really big takeaway for me as someone who can sometimes get distracted by the frustration. So thank you for the inspiration and the history lesson, and also the motivation to keep going forward. We appreciate that.
And thanks for doing this. Actually, it's great. We need more of this. So thank you very much, Public Interest Alberta.
You're welcome. We'll see you all next when we talk to Jason Schilling, the president of ATA, at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday next week. Thanks all. Have a good night.